All right, let me go ahead and get started. Um, this I've already recorded part two. That starts with the actual paper itself. Uh, we're continuing with Angela Friederici's book on brain basis to language from structure to function. First time I recorded part one, the microphone wasn't working. Now it is. But I've already recorded part two, so it would be, and I already divided the first episode, I already ended the first part of it, now I have the second part of it, so it would get us out of sync to call this part two. That's why this is part one, part two. Um, okay. Right. So, in the previous session, I was talking about the stakes of what neurolinguistics as a project is doing and how this paper that we're going to look at fits in with that general project, the kind of value that we get out of looking at it, what's interesting to me, and the kind of questions we want to ask and considerations we want to think about when we're going through the paper. This is getting, so the second part gets kind of right down to a core element, which the brass tacks, as I call it here, the Chomsky thing. So, as I had mentioned earlier, the element that she really cares a lot about is that language is that the brain areas which mediate language are specialized for language and not general processing, and they're unique to humans. And it's sympathetic with the Chomsky's consideration of language. He wrote the preface to the book, consonant with the idea of innate or universal grammar, a part of the brain that's specialized for grammar so that all humans have a shared capacity for grammar that's innate with being human, and that provides some kind of basis for what my argument might be called a universal grammar. And Friederici's made some statements that seem sympathetic to that view, or providing, a neuroscience basis for that kind of approach. So a classic framing with anything in linguistics, the Chomskyan position, is I don't know if you can say hegemony. There's a lot of disagreement in. I don't know if there's consensus on anything in linguistics. It's a very fragmented field. But as far as their major positions, Chomsky's innate grammar is a really dominant position. It's the first couple of pages you read in almost any linguistics book starts with that. And there are a couple of things that come with Chomsky innate universal grammar. There's a set of basic principles or rules that all humans have a capacity specifically for grammar that gives them certain predilections, certain practices that are universal across all humans. And he takes a kind of formalist approach, and he separates the competence or capacity, grammar capacity, from actual performance. So there's a universal capacity that all humans have for grammar, but in actual performance, humans can fail to, there's all kinds of constraints, practical constraints, in learning ability and the pragmatic considerations that he separates from the grammar capacity. Competence versus performance. So I think I was saying a little, I think I said last time, and I'll say it in the next part. There are lots of parts of language processing that aren't really covered in this. And there's been arguments that there's a bias towards grammar-centric approaches towards studying language. But that kind of follows this, that, the competence is really grammar-centric, where this is like a core language, this is the core language facility, and then there are all these other hanger-on systems that are engaged with performance, and there's a kind of hermetic separation There's a separation in their processing, or just in your analysis, you should separate these things. So pragmatics and linguistics, and grammar, study of syntax and how syntax feeds into semantics as a formal grammar processing should be separated from the pragmatic concepts, which is different than, arguably different than how some cognitive linguistics approaches would see all language processing embedded in action systems, action processing generally, and you can't separate grammar from pragmatics, and a lot of time they a lot of their characteristic studies would be like metaphors, where you get you think of like a idiom that you hear or some metaphor, and you're not really taking the grammar at face value to understand the meaning of some idioms. Letting the cat out of the bag. Your understanding of that has nothing to do with cats, nothing to do with the verbs of them being let out, except in a really abstract sense. But you have a mental image of that in the context that you're in, that you get the meaning. Okay. So, which, the formalists don't necessarily, they tell a story too about how you get the meaning from that. Okay, anyway, I don't want to get too deep into it now. We'll get into it also as we're going through different, as we're going through the paper. I wanted to start a little with my position up front. I'm wary of certain parts of Chomsky's approach. And since Friederici wants to start with the thesis that Broca's area is specialized for language and a platform for a Chomskyan kind of innate grammar, this is a great vehicle for actually exploring. I don't want to say, I'm really curious about this issue, so I'm really glad that there's an approach that looks at grammar through this lens, that gives you some traction on actually thinking through what is core language processing, just as a general principle. I haven't read her book, so my ideas of her purpose, are subject to change if I actually read her book. But we're just going to consider some ideas just for the present article. And these are, I think I said before, these are like half-baked ideas, just for discussion's sake. So I'm not necessarily wedded to some of the things that I'm saying in these slides. But it's, starting point, a kind of first layer of the onion to think about some things, and I might change them if I thought through them, if I were being more particular about it. So one thing is Chomsky's position, just the approach of studying grammar from linguistic behavior is a naturally different starting point than looking at the brain, thinking I talked last time about, the project of computational neuroscience, where you're looking at brain areas, you're looking at the structure of it and trying to connect the structure with the function that it's performing. Just those orientations by themselves give you different starting points for what you're even talking about. And then as I'm doing this, I'm also going through neurolinguistics, and I think the neurolinguistics program is, well, I'm not, from my reading of it so far, it seems kind of more put together more developed than the neurolinguistics program, which is still kind of more fragmented. But I'm seeing this also in the neurolinguistics program, where you have what economists, the economic behaviorist economists are talking about it, and the neurological structures that are mediating the processing underlying that behavior, and they're talking at different levels. And in that neuroeconomics literature, they're more careful to distinguish the levels that you're describing the functions. And part of the project itself, Glimcher wrote a whole book on foundations of neuroeconomic analysis that was really good about this, and really disciplined to have like principles. So he also had kind of a 3-level approach. At the basis is the neurological systems. At the mid level is psychological. What psychologists, just the models that psychologists build, and at the top level are the more abstract, what economists, theories that and equations that economists are putting together. And it's very disciplined about having bridge principles that will, so you can bridge the explanation that you're getting at the neurological level, at the psychological level, and then at the economist's level. So having read that, when I look at the neurolinguistics project, it occurs to me I haven't seen the same, and it could be out there, but I haven't seen myself articles or the same kind of discipline in having bridge principles. And I see more cases of talking about linguistics, behavior by humans and processing that's happening in brains, overlapping, conflating those two levels of description, which raises a red flag for me, having just read that neuroeconomics literature, that you can't necessarily be sure that you might need some bridge principles, and there could be cases where there are different levels of analysis. But that's what I'm kind of starting. That's what I mean by Chomsky's position is starting from a slightly different position. The things that he's looking. So he's looking for rules of grammar. I mean, at the basis of it, he's looking to develop, equations or models to explain human practice of grammar, rules of grammar that are innate, that you can find across languages. And only via those rules of grammar, the kind of assumption that there's an underlying shared mechanism of grammar, and that competence or capacity is separate from the use. So what he's talking about here is you're separating the contribution of pragmatics. He literally separates the study of grammar from the study of pragmatics. Pragmatics is the contribution of, context, world elements to resolving ambiguities in sentences, whereas grammar is very strictly the logical structure of grammar in a sentence, the syntax that informs what the meaning of a sentence is, and he separates that that's different processing. And his, but as I was just saying, you could have a shared mechanism, but just because you have a shared mechanism, he doesn't necessarily, a shared capacity doesn't necessarily assume that you're going to get anything that you could articulate as a rule of grammar, much less shared rules of grammars across languages or across individuals. There seems to be something shared, and I'll get in more detail on the next page what I mean by that too. And then this, pragmatic processing versus grammar processing. I'm thinking about those neuroeconomic models where, the models that linguists are building, like the models that the economists are building, there's not just a one-to-one match to neurological systems. And when you just try to force a one-to-one match, you're talking apples and oranges. So these are kind of red flags I come from when I think about, Chomsky's position, looking at it from the, neurological analysis. And then also his starting point was a poverty of data and denial of bootstrap learning of grammar capacity. So as the legend goes, he would follow around an infant and write down everything an infant hears, and just considering that like the data set the infant has to work with, and concluding that there's a poverty of stimulus. There's not enough data here that would distinguish grammatical rules. Therefore, there has to be some pre-existing rules that the data that the linguistic data that infants are getting in just unleashes that it taps into this pre-existing innate grammar. And it's very dismissive of what you might call bootstrap learning, that rules of grammar can bootstrap on previous levels of learning. He has this kind of conception that grammar capacity is like kind of fully formed as an innate structure, that languages just, in a pragmatic sense, just tap into that capacity, like other human capacities, like vision. So people can, uh, that's a good analogy, is something like vision, like a sense organ vision. So people can look around the world and they can interpret things that they're seeing, but all humans have a shared capacity of vision. Um, different isolated structures in the brain where that process is occurring that's shared across different species. So then you have cases of I'm here in Japan and they use the same word for blue and green, ao, whereas in uh, um, English, those are two separate colors. But, in the universal capacity sense, you'd say, well, of course they see the same colors, but they're just, in the practice of it, they're, tagging, labeling different parts of the spectrum with different labels, but that doesn't mean that the underlying capacity of vision is the same. So that's what he wants to kind of do for grammar. There's an innate capacity for grammar, almost like a sense organ, a grammatical sense organ. Okay, we'll get more into that later. But this so like vision isn't bootstrapped. You could, in neurotypical examples, you could put someone in a room that only has horizontal lines and they never see a vertical line, and then their vision isn't going to develop properly. But outside of those weirdo cases, maybe there's a kind of logic to it. So one issue is that, as I think I said in the previous session, bootstrap learning is all over cognitive science. It's like a theme that you see running over and over. So if your starting point is denying bootstrap learning, and I mentioned bootstrap learning in the sense of like feed-forward signals, then you get feedback signals from action, and the mismatch between those recalibrates the performative, and processes bootstrap over previous processes, and you have an iterative learning. If your starting point was anti-bootstrap, denial that bootstrap learning happens, that would be a very unfortunate starting point for the way a lot of cognitive mechanisms, probably including language and grammar learning, work. So that idea of falling around a baby and it not being able to bootstrap language from the grammar it's getting, that's an unfortunate starting point, and probably, I want to say probably not true, but that's something to follow up on. So that's just my intuition from things I've read. Okay, so anyway, what it means though is when you read about the assumptions that people that do generative grammar and the models they make at that linguistics level. And again, I'm thinking about the neuroeconomics between what the models economists are making and neuroeconomists are making. So you listen to the kind of things that grammar people studying grammar, something like generative grammar, and what the innate rules of grammar must be. The way they talk about cognitive processing of language is really different than the way people, working neuroscientists work. And sometimes it's, they just like this assumption that just bootstrap learning just doesn't happen. And like paragraph 1, starting your entire foundation of your entire worldview, bootstrap learning doesn't happen. Whereas the neuroscientist, paragraph 1, your foundation, what you're building, bootstrap is the fundamental principle. That kind of total mismatch. I'm dramatizing it, but you can. So I give this example of so Hickok and Small have a fantastic overview, and I might walk through this. This might be some future sessions I take from this book, Neurobiology of Language, a couple of years old. But this is the one that it's kind of the cutting edge for the time. It's not monolithic. So, for example, the fact that they even have these grammar, linguists that are contributing to explain what grammar means for neuroscientists. It's great that they have different views that don't agree with each other. But the point is if you look at this chapter in this book, it's all, neuroscientists are writing all the chapters except for this one chapter, and it struck me as a very dramatic. If you want to see what I'm talking about, this chapter was like a fish out of water compared to all the other chapters in that book, and just kind of the understanding about what cognitive processing even is. And again, it struck me, so vanilla generative grammar isn't a good fit with neurolinguistics and the kind of assumptions and the way that they think. And when you read it, you see, something has to give, and possibly on both sides. And again, so it's reminding me of the people in the neuroeconomics literature. So Glimcher is kind of one of the leading figures in the neuroeconomics literature. So he'll start with really foundational points of economists. So a really foundational point an economist would start with is that there is no utility. There's no absolute utility. There's just relative utility. You just see only human action. We can't read people's brains. All we can see is their action, and we can see if you have three items, A, B, and C, transitivity of if you prefer A over B and B over C, you need to prefer A over C to be rational, and just kind of minimally rational. Just relative utility. You never know the absolute utility, how much someone inherently wants a thing. You just know that in their behavior they're preferring this one object A over object B, and if they do that, they should be consistent, and it builds everything off of these kind of minimal. But of course, we do have cognitive, neurological models where you can measure something that looks a lot like a utility. It's attacking one of the most fundamental principles that economists start with, and it's really interesting how he kind of massages that point. I told you he has these bridge principles, and he'll explain, to people reading this, when you talk to an economist, you need to understand that this is a red line for them, and they're not going to accept crossing it. But, the neuroscience has spoken. The red line has been crossed, but these are the bridging principles because we're going to reconstruct their models. We're going to recover their basic models, even though this red line has been crossed. And when you're talking to an economist, you need to, he gives strategies for how to talk to an economist, because they're not going to accept what the neuroscience is saying. They have to. They're going to need to. I think I said last time, if there's a disparity, the neuroscience is going to win. But you do actually recover a lot of what they're talking about, and a lot of the problem with a lot of neuroeconomics work being done is that the neuroscientists didn't understand economics. And you could see how if they had that red line, how they just don't want to talk to each other. And he found it really important that neuroscientists need to understand these economist models to know how to recover them and build these bridging principles. So now we're talking about neurolinguistics. To me, it looks really similar. There's this red line that a lot of people working in linguistics don't want to cross, but the neuroscience seems to have already crossed it. But we need these linguistic, principles, this work, and we need to figure out bridging principles and how to recover it. So I kind of see a family resemblance to these projects. And in that sense, I say here, Friederici gets props for being one of the few working in the neuroscience camp that are actually trying to bridge what linguists are doing, and what neuroscientists are doing, from the neuroscientists' side of the equation. So she's actually trying to figure, she's actually looking at areas of the brain and consonant with the kind of models that linguists have built. Okay, some of my position. I'll give. Um, this page is just more of like about this disparity between grammatical models and neuroscience models, um, just to kind of put on the table. So one thing that that principle that bootstrap learning doesn't happen, or you can't bootstrap a grammar from nothing. Well, of course we have deep learning paradigms. Um, so you have something like Google Translate, and it bootstrapped the grammar of dozens of language from de novo, from nothing, just from inputs alone. Um, and the kind of algorithms it's has was using is vastly deficient to human language or humans, neurological capacity. Um, Humans have orders of magnitude more synaptic connections doing process, or more neurons doing processing than the nodes in the neural nets that are bootstrapping all these different languages from nothing. So if Chomsky's thesis depends that humans couldn't possibly bootstrap language from nothing, there's not enough capacity. You look at the deep learning program, you can say, well, that's just not right. Depending on how strongly he wants to make a point like that. I didn't actually want to make that point because deep learning itself isn't really on the right track. I think I was complaining about overly formalistic models and processing that was, just associationist and not actually embedded in kind of functional action contexts, the context of human action in the world to maximize utility or whatever it is. So deep learning approaches aren't really on the right track either, so I didn't want to make too much of this point. The brain's computations are more Grossbergian than deep learning. But it's just the point that, that might even make the point even stronger. Like even deep learning, which is below what humans do, can bootstrap grammar from nothing. And also, just again, getting back to bootstrapping grammar and grammar capacity. What's the value of separating those? I'll come back to it. That kind of question. And then it's the way you're framing things too. So this is what I've been saying a couple of times. The bootstrap model is all over the mind. And even stronger than that, Friederici has some models that she's presenting in this paper itself, and one of them, kind of the baseline one, looks like a bootstrap model. So she has, the kind of early language processing is signal recognition of language, match it against a template, there's a mismatch, and then you reconstruct the meaning based, according to the mismatch, and then you could reasonably hypothesize that this mismatch is going to recalibrate the template. That's a form of bootstrap learning of grammar. So bootstrapped competence and bootstrapped performance might not be as separable as Chomsky wants, and Friederici, that's even supporting Chomskyan innate grammar, herself is proposing a bootstrap model as part of the processing. So I think I mentioned earlier, like, biology doesn't like drawing hard lines, so just saying bootstrapping has no place, like some linguistic books actually say in their very first page is the foundation of their entire, program, you can't draw that hard of a line. And we're not doing it here. So Friederici must mean something more, more nuanced. Mismatch bootstrapping is a central principle found all over the place in neuroscience. It's arbitrary to distinguish this one area, grammar competence, from the greater trend. So it would be strange that grammar competence would be so wildly different than other competences humans have, human action, humans perform, like eye-hand coordination. This is kind of the starting point for, like I was saying, cognitive grammar. where they want to understand grammar as kind of a general human act performance. So I myself recognize the evidence supporting the conclusion that Broca's area is really specialized, that there is something special about grammar like processing that's, specialized for grammar and different than just kind of action processing, but not so much where I draw a hard line and saying bootstrapping can't be part of it. So it seems to me like bootstrapping is a part of grammar processing, of learning rules of grammar, while it's still a competence. Maybe that example of vision and seeing colors divided differently, because once you start using different words for colors, okay, I don't want to get too much in the nuance of it, but having lived in Japan and America, I can see like different colors. I did start to see the color green differently when I thought of it as part of blue. The color itself doesn't literally change in my experience, but my orientation towards it changed. So just because there's an underlying capacity, you could still have some kind of bootstrapping and plasticity built in there. Like, it's really nuanced, and the point is it's a lot more nuanced than the models that the linguists are using. And if you're not nuanced about making a neuroscience model, what I would worry about is the linguists just taking the neuroscience model that should be a lot more subtle and being ham-fisted with it. Okay, anyway. Any theory that starts with the command to ignore bootstrap capacity building or to separate grammar and pragmatics, competence, performance is going to be out of touch. Yeah, I set an awful starting point. I don't want to stand too I don't want to stand too strongly on this kind of conclusion. I just wrote this in the heat of the moment. But I think the whole punchline I'm making is these models need to be nuanced, and you could have maybe you can have your innate capacity in bootstrapping too. Okay. Also, a point I want to make about rules and levels. Like I said, Chomsky's program is to isolate innate rules, and neural networks generally, there's a separation between symbolic rule. There are arguments. Arguably, the level of symbolic rules is at a different level of processing than the so for example, speaking of grammar, there's reason to believe the reflexive sense. When you hear an ungrammatical sentence, you feel a reflex that it sounds wrong. At the same time, when you ask someone what's the rule of grammar, they can recite a rule for you and see how the different rule applies. So there's the kind of hot processing, the kind of reflex that sounds wrong, and then the cold processing, like learning rules and playing them by rote. And there's plenty of examples all over human action where humans first learn a rule cold by the explicit in-language rule, and like thinking of the rules of chess. You're moving them according to you're just according to the cold rules that someone tells you, and then over practice it starts getting burnt in as a reflex, where you just feel the right moves, or you just start feeling the ungrammaticality. And even in the neuroscience picture, there's a lot of description how cold processing works differently than hot processing. So explicitly following rules in a really inefficient way, in a really ham-fisted, brute force way, like that's frontal lobe. We're talking about executive processing happening in frontal lobe, and following demands in a brute force way, the executive processing brute forcing actions. And then over time, there are rules where actions can get kind of troped in templates. So, for example, in cerebellum, in motor cortex, where more reflexive senses can get built in, and then the actual processing, it's plastic and it actually kind of changes. The wiring gets developed over time. That kind of picture is a lot more nuanced. So when you say rules, you can have hot rules and cold rules on doing processing in parallel. So even the idea of trying to figure out what the rules are from a neuroscience perspective, you may try, and there could be a really nuanced interplay also, because you feel something sounds wrong and then you think about the rule and try to apply it, or you're just hearing the rule and you're running it over and over in your mind to bootstrap up the intuition that feels wrong too. Like top down and bottom up attention happening in parallel and feeding off each other. So the whole project of trying to find rules of grammar, like the linguists want, may be a misleading task from what the neuroscientists are going to look at how things are wired, and form follows structure, and be a lot more nuanced about what they mean by rules, and at the agent level of cold rules versus at the commitments that you want to follow versus the deeper neuroscience level. Okay, so anyway, whatever. If your task starts with looking for rules, that might be not the most helpful starting point. It's maybe good for the systems and algorithms that are mediating it, and see how rule-like behavior emerges from that. Okay. Yeah, so Broca's area is integrated with articulatory planning. So it is a form of action planning. It's in the frontal lobe. It looks like a kind of memory capacity. It's structuring elements of language that are linked to each other. So to what extent you can separate, how is Broca's area integrated into human action? Okay, you don't want to start with the conclusion that they're completely hermetically sealed. And then levels also. Okay, so that's about rules. Levels, I think I've already said this, but the computational level isn't necessarily the explicit or symbolic level. So again, the overemphasis on the Frege paradigm of everything's logical symbols. You can have an agent that understands that can process logical symbols, applying predicates to subjects. The grass is green, at a really symbolic level of just applying a feature, a property to an object, which is different than just having the innate intuition when you see grass, you want to say green, applying to like what the surface is. Those are different levels. When I mean levels of processing, like one thing is that from the Mars perspective is how the algorithm of language, when you're looking at a brain area, like understanding this is the function it's trying to apply, this is an algorithm you would walk through, the system would walk through to address that function, and at the bottom here's the actual, the wiring that's instantiating this algorithm. That's like the computational level. But that could be different than the symbolic level. At the symbolic level, you could have, and this is what I think a lot of rules of language, not just rules of language grammar, rules of anything, like rules of chess, again before, rules of, social behavior, explicit rules, are at a symbolic level. Like at a higher level, you have computational processing of that, concepts emerge, and then you can have at the concept level this kind of higher emergent level of of a commitment to follow certain what feels like rules or commitments, pre-existing commitments an agent has made at this higher level, and all that processing, the computational level is not instantiating the symbolic level of applying a property to an object in this way of thinking. The agent is committing to recognizing this structure as applying a property, and he forces that commitment, like again, the bottom up and top down intention. You can force that commitment down in the way you're acting. That's a lot different than saying the wiring is actually wired to do that. So this idea that processing happens at multiple levels, and again, like in neuroeconomics, we talk about bridging principles. A lot of what economists, the models they build may be like agent level commitments that work at a different level than the way brains are wired to maximize utility that the humans might not even be aware that they're maximizing. They just have an intuition, and their intuition happens to be Nash, optimal, but they don't know that. But the humans may have rules of thumb that they have commitments to that they're following that have economic reasoning to them too. Okay, different levels. Okay. The level in which the agent commits rules of grammar versus the feeling of ungrammaticality that directs the agent's attention. So here's kind of two paradigmatic ways of thinking about the different levels. This doesn't necessarily contradict what Friederici's saying in these. So she's going to be looking at the wiring of structures. So again, I don't want to make too hard of a claim that this is contradicting anything that Friederici says. These are just things we could think about as we're looking at this paper. Anyway, so the punchline, so traditional linguistics is grammar heavy and formalist. Neurolinguistics is more fit to meaning. Meaning has a functional role. What the construction of meaning has a kind of functional role in human action, and neurolinguistics is geared towards, certain functions, like we said, that are, built from evolution and natural selection that aren't necessarily so grammar heavy. And grammar formalism looks like it's on the symbolic level, at the agent level, whereas wiring is at the computational level. So just at that really kind of base level, at that naive level, it looks like what linguists are looking at is this agent level, whereas what neuroscience are looking at is this computational level. And then there's a lot of really complicated bridging theories you're going to need to bridge those two levels. And you can't, I say naively maybe in two senses, you can't naively just conflate the two, but also it's naive to just say that's the simple way the system works. You have these two levels. I'm not so sure it's just really simply two levels either. So the whole point is, let's think about these kinds of considerations when we're looking at this paper. I don't want to make too big of a claim, too hard of a claim now. I don't have that much confidence. Okay, so this is the last page I'll do for today. Some of my own ideas, and again, I'm not really, this is just kind of fast and loose. I'm not really tied to these. Some of my ideas about Broca's area in grammar and cognitive linguistics. It does seem to be a mechanism for dependence relations, functional nodes, and action planning. Dependence relations, like a property depends on its object. When you're saying the grass is green, there's a dependence relation between grass and greenness that's mediated by the verb. It's usually the verb kind of at the center. Often has, in computer science, you think about arguments that you put into a function. You fill in arguments, and the function will give you an output. So the two arguments for a verb like is in this function is you apply a predicate to the subject. You pop in the two arguments of the grass is the subject and green is the predicate, and the the system just churns out that you apply the grass, greenness to the grass, something like that. That's grammar. Broca's area seems to be associated with that kind of functioning. It is involving dependence relations. This is a lot of what Friederici is saying. Like, this is a special kind of memory. And it's grammar and memory like, it's a capacity like. So the point is if you look at other species, they don't have this capacity of, this argument style or this dependence relations. And this just generally the way memory works. So an experiment that really dramatized it for me is like wide memory versus deep like in the sense of nested memory, deep. If you gorilla memory is wide. Other primates, the memory is wider in the sense that like the paradigmatic experiment was you have like 25 numbers that flash for just a second, and then they're covered with like a filled in circle, and the task is you have to point at all the 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's just randomly allotted, and in the flash of the second you have to remember all 25 in order. And the gorillas are really good at this. As I understand, they can do like all 25, where humans, they see that for just a blip, and they're lucky if they can get through like 4, 5, 6, and then they're just lost. Whereas human memory is nested. You can remember how does the sentence go? The dog that chased the cat, that chased the mouse, that chased that was running after the cheese. It's like 4 levels deep, and humans don't have any problem understanding the situation, what's going on when you keep nesting memory. You put dependence relations on each item of memory in terms of the others, so you can picture the whole thing of these 4 objects, one following the other, each one in a dependence relation on the previous node. Humans are good at that kind of processing, and other animals aren't. Evidence like that, and the things that Friederici is going to look at, are really great evidence that it's a different kind of capacity. Like, it's a different, like vision is a capacity that's not just bootstrapped the way, anyway, that it's an innate capacity. So there's that part of it. It does mediate a competence, of which grammar is a species of it's a kind of, grammar is one category, this kind of dependence relation, nested kind of memory that humans have and other animals don't seem to have. But what we call grammar, that's different. So the next book I want to look at this is going to be Bogdan's Predicative Thinking, and the whole punchline there is this kind of formal dependent, because dependence relations of objects lends itself towards formalism. That's what predicative calculus is. At its real root, it's a form of set theory where it's logical dependence relations of objects on other objects, nodes and edges, and set theory is a necessary part, but what we call the grammar practice maybe go way beyond that. I was really persuaded by a lot of what Bogdan was saying. I thought he needed to do a lot better job of tying what he was saying to the neuroscience, and this is another task. I think of it as another task of, you need to reconstruct what he's saying in terms of what the neuroscience is saying, and you may have to change some of it. But I like this kind of answer because, Friederici's trying to make the argument against the cognitive scientists that you have to have this kind of formal dependence relations that's really specific. It's a specific capacity that humans have. It gives you an innate ability, an innate capacity that other animals don't have. It's grammar-like. It's grammar as a capacity that sounds like innate grammar. And, Chomsky likes the sound of that. You can still say that and still say it's necessary but not sufficient. So you're not it's a different counter argument to Friederici than the cognitive linguists, which are trying to say that Broca's area is just normal working memory, just beefed up. I can do the brute force learning better, but it's not really specific towards dependence relations and the logical formalism. Okay. So that's why, that's another reason why I like this paper, because it's putting in place that kind of formal part that I think is a necessary and part of language, but I think it leaves parts out. I don't like the hermetically sealing off the formal part from, well, it's going to get really nuanced. So when we look at Bogdan's, that's why I'm putting these two. This is the foil to kind of Bogdan's theory that I want to look at next. And we can get in all these questions in a lot more detail. I don't want to say anything too, I don't want to say anything I'll regret later. I don't want to make too hard of a claim right now. But these are the same things I'm thinking about. Formal grammar seems to be part of it, but necessary, but maybe not sufficient. Also, hierarchical dependence relations. Formalism likes hierarchy, where A is necessarily dependent on B. Hierarchical means the shifting dependence relations. Sometimes bigger scale things depend on what's happening with smaller things. Sometimes smaller things depend on larger things. Sometimes your large executive goal depends on the small details of the situation. Sometimes the small details of the situation or your recognition of it depend on your overall executive goals. There's top down and bottom up attention can shift hierarchical dependence relations. So that's like a big monkey wrench you're throwing into this formal grammatical system. It doesn't sit well with formal predicative calculus that likes hierarchical relations that don't flip in hierarchical ways, at least not easily. Okay. Hierarchical dependence relations and action planning capacity, which naturally supports lexico-grammar-like practice, but the algorithms are linked to, embedded, and are inseparable from action planning and pragmatics. So this part of this, part of what's determining dependence relations, is the actual pragmatic context that you find in yourself, and this is all that a lot of what Bogdan's talking about. Why do you apply green to grass in the way that you do, that kind of dependence relation, versus letting the cat out of the bag in a metaphorical way, whereas the dependence relation may be different. The action context may color that. So making a hard separation from pragmatics may be premature. Also, just in a sense, there's no real clear... they use the term lexico-grammar because there's a recognition that words aren't really separated from grammar. There's not really a clear... And also in the brain, it's not really clear that there is a lexicon of rules of grammar and words, which was kind of surprising for the people looking for it. Right? It's much more fragmented. When people think about action words and verbs, different areas of the brain light up than people think about nouns and objects. That make it hard to figure out what is even lexicogrammar. This is another reason why, just starting with vanilla Chomsky, that there's innate rules of grammar, you're not going to find a set place where like rules are collected like a lexicon. So that's another reason why there has to be more going on to it. All right, there are learned hierarchical function action nodes we call words. When we get to the part, Friederici's not looking at words, or how words are represented, how items of lexicogrammar are really represented in this paper. But when we get to a paper, we're going to look at that. Okay. Key point for me, if grammar isn't specialized in this, the way that the formalists want it, it links with semantic and action processing. It's in a context. Okay. When we get to examples, I can, I don't want to, again, it's biology, I don't want to make too hard of a claim, like a perfect rule. Yeah, it doesn't come with innate rules, much less grammatical rules. Or at least that's a misleading framing if you're trying to look at what the brain's doing. If you're trying to look for a mental lexicon, that's a bad framing to start with, because it turns out the brain is fragmenting the processing behind what looks like lexical grammatical items in a lot of different places, in a lot of different action contexts. We see bootstrap learning all over the place. So if your theory starts with bootstrap learning doesn't happen, you can't start with that framing. Some ways of bootstrapping grammar are more facilitated than others, but the distinction between rule and capacity is blurred. And again, here's where I mentioned Radu Bogdan's book, and I call his approach the Bogdan bootstrap, which is probably not fair because the neuroscientists have done a lot of study about how the brain bootstraps things, and Bogdan just has this one theory that's not as well bolstered by the neuroscience literature as it could be. But I don't know, I want to reconstruct Bogdan's bootstrap in terms of neuroscience bootstraps. So when we look at his book, we can talk about it then. Yeah, here's a really brief picture of his image. Is the sentence is like a skeleton. So this and the practice of giving meaning to a sentence is like fleshing out the skeleton. Skeleton rules. So formal rules of meaning construction out of elements. So again, that the verbs has different arguments, and when you pop in the arguments, the function of the verb is to apply these argument values, like the direct object and the indirect object. The grandfather gave the piece of candy to his granddaughter. So every one of those words, the direct object, the indirect object is the candy, the direct object, oh, goodness sake, is the daughter, and the subject is the grandfather. And the meaning comes out of that. So in his approach, that argument, function argument setup, that's like the skeleton, the formal skeleton, but to actually put meaning to it and to have the image of a grandfather giving a piece of candy to his granddaughter, there's a lot more that gets roped in to that processing of meaning. And so the formal part is necessary but not sufficient. And it has to be bootstrapped. You have to bootstrap the logical structure to the pragmatic systems. That's like core about what learning grammar is in the Bogdan bootstrap. So if your starting point is to separate grammar from pragmatics, the Bogdan bootstrap approach is going to frown on your attempt, because the whole grammar development process, first language acquisition in child development, this is like the core process. So you don't want to start with hermetically sealing them off as two different things, if you want to understand how grammar is learned and where grammar comes from in human brains. But you can already see the way I'm describing it now. It cuts the Chomsky line sideways. So it's good to get rid of vanilla Chomskyism received in textbooks. You read these linguist textbooks where chapter 1 gives kind of the Chomskyan hegemony. Some of those seem to be like a dogma that need, no bootstrap learning. What were some of the others? Separating pragmatics from grammar. Hegemony, dogma. For linguists, those might be really useful theoretical. This is again like what neuroeconomics is doing, separating the work that economists are doing from what neuroscientists are looking for in the brain. You need to separate these things for the neuroscience of it. But having those separation, having those concepts might be actually useful for the work of people studying grammar from behavior. Just the theoretical tools. So that may be fine. But you don't want that to infect studying the neuroscience of it, because it may have you looking at the wrong things. That's the point there. But it's cutting Chomsky sideways. I think the point you can see I'm trying to make, I'm not trying to say it would also be a mistake to be so anti-Chomskyan as a dogma, to be dogmatically anti-Chomskyan where ignoring grammar-like processes supporting syntax learning, when you see it. So I'm actually, a lot of what I'm saying is, consonant with the thesis of innate grammar and a lot of what Friederici is looking at in his paper. So I'm just saying don't be dogmatic. And again, it's biology. You don't want to be too dogmatic about anything, because the one, common theme in a lot of biology is for every rule you make, there's always exceptions. You usually define the rules in terms of exceptions that prove the rules. You're actually expecting some exceptions. So you don't want to be too dogmatic about anything you say, or you're going to get mud on your face. Anyway, so you don't want to be too anti-Chomskyan. So that's a criticism I have to some approaches in ironically, cognitive linguists, especially the ones that try to be really anti-Chomskyan, they tend to actually, even though they call themselves cognitive linguistics, if you read their papers, they, at least 10 years ago, it's probably changing now, they're really out of touch with the neuroscience happening. They were developing this kind of separate thing, similar in economics, like the behavioral economists and prospect theory. They're kind of doing their own thing they call it cognitive, but it's actually not really attached to the neuroscience. And what's happening today in neuroeconomics and neurolinguistics is actually taking, cognitive linguistics and prospect theory and economics and behavioral economics, and actually connecting it to the neuroscience, neurolinguistics and neuroeconomics. Okay, so the cognitive linguistics, some of them are really dogmatically anti-Chomskyan. And so Friederici in some parts of the paper will be criticizing them, the people that are saying Broca's area is just, it's just brute force working memory that's just more powerful. There's nothing special to grammatical processing, and she attacks that. So I'm sympathetic, that's what I'm saying. You don't be so anti-Chomskyan, or you might be wrong. So that's what this says. We should ditch Chomskyan allergies to bootstrapping, being ruleless, mixing capacity and practice. But we can reclaim some Chomskyan ideas of specialization, the innatism of this kind of processing anyway. That this is a special kind of processing of nested independence relations. And it's, again, I just said it's similar to neuroeconomics, where economists have an allergy to subjective utility, but we need subjective utility, a concept in neuroeconomics. But it's okay, economists, that we have this, because we're going to reclaim a lot of your theories anyway. That's another topic. Okay. So I think I may have implied this, but I'll say this explicitly now, that Friederici, I think, knows a lot of what I've been saying. I know that there's a bit of bait and switch with what she's making of what she's calling Chomskyism. She had Chomsky write the preface to her book. And she's saying, her theories are providing a foundation for innate grammar and a Chomskyan approach. But I think, like I said, she can't be too anti-bootstrap, because in her own theory, in her own model, she's presenting a bootstrap model. So, depending on how you understand Chomskyism, and some people could, and then again, like the different levels of analysis that you're even looking at the problem. I use the term bait and switch here, in the sense that she's saying what she's doing is, providing a foundation for Chomskyism, but one could understand that it's not actually vanilla Chomskyism that she's providing a foundation for. It's Chomsky-like. Like a lot of the conclusions, you can find versions of what that is in the model she's providing, but she knows, it seems in her work that she understands the differences, because she's doing good neuroscience, and some things that linguists are talking about are going to have to be changed. That's a lot of the point I've been making. So what is a bait and switch move this is maybe too strong, so I don't want to say that she's explicit it. This is like an explicit strategy, but I want to think about if this is like a kind of move she's making where she's redefining what Chomskyism means. That's different from the vanilla version, but it fits the models and it's close enough to innate grammar, to make it worth tying the two together. And again, that's like kind of like what the neuroeconomists are doing. They understand some parts of the neuroscience aren't fitting with the economists' classic models. We want to reconstruct a lot of their models, with different, even if we have to tweak some of the foundations. That's what this says here. So I think, I want to ask the question, do you think some of what Friederici might be doing is redefining what innate grammar means in terms of this providing a platform for something that looks like innate grammar, in terms of this, dependence relation capacity that might be different than what Chomsky thought it was going to be, but close enough that, if she presents this as the banner of innate grammar, a lot of people that study grammar can just take up this banner without necessarily realizing that there's been a bait and switch. But that's better for everybody. Like, they'll catch on. Just like neuroeconomics, more and more of them are looking at behavioral economics, and then as that gets tweaked by the neuroeconomics program, everybody's going to come on board with the neuroscience of it. It's a kind of way to push the theoretical development along in a certain constructive way. You can kind of, like I said, hitch the wagons. There's a lot of initiative. There's a lot of work that's been done in the Chomskyan paradigm. So hitching your wagon to a lot of this pre-existing work could be really valuable, because, especially if it turns out there's this kind of dependence relation that really looks like an innate competence or capacity. Okay, that's everything I wanted to say for today, for this session. And next time we'll start with the actual paper itself, finally. Thanks, everybody. That's all for this time. Bye.